Hello, my name is Alyssa Dragnich, and I teach at Arizona State University, Sandra O'Connor College of Law. Today I'll be talking to you about attention spans, summarizing some of the current research into attention spans, and then talking about what that means for our classes and for ourselves. Let's start with a definition of an attention span, which just means the length of time that a person can attend continuously to one type of stimulus. How long can you focus on one particular stimulus? Several years ago, a study came out saying that American attention spans were now shorter than that of a goldfish, which is apparently 8 seconds. And lots of people were, of course, very worried and thought that this meant that our society was doomed. Basically, this made for a lot of funny headlines, but it's not really an accurate statement. First, it's important to know that this study actually related to people looking specifically at internet advertisements, right? It really wasn't designed for how long will people read something or listen to something or watch something. It's specifically talking about internet ads. And this original idea of comparing a person's attention span to a goldfish's attention span has actually been around for a while, and it sort of seems to be an internet myth that just keeps getting repeated as opposed to anything that's based on science. So if that makes you feel better, your attention span probably is longer than that of a goldfish's, and I don't even know how long a goldfish can pay attention to something. People often say things like, students have a 10 to 20 minute attention span. If we were asked, I think most of us would agree with this, particularly if we're talking about something like a lecture. Note, if we are talking about an online video, such as this one, attention span might actually be quite a bit shorter than this. I just flag that for any of you who may be prepping videos for asynchronous online classes this fall, given everything that's going on. If that is you, you might actually want to make your videos quite a bit shorter than this, and there's a lot of other research out there and tips that you can look into for that kind of thing. But for a live class, an in-person class, I feel that I can definitely talk for 10 to 20 minutes before my students' minds start to wander. Interestingly, though, the studies don't really necessarily support this idea of a 10 to 20 minute duration. The studies are actually all over the place. If you look at this slide, people have tried to measure student attention span in a number of different ways. And I suspect one of the reasons that the study results vary so much is because it's actually quite a hard thing to measure, right? So in some of the studies, they put a person in the back of the room who's just sort of watching the class, right? So that's sort of the observer model. But then the question becomes, what is the observer actually watching? Like what measure are we using to say, hey, that student is paying attention or not? So one thing they look at is, are students taking notes, right? How many notes are the students taking? But of course you have to guarantee that the notes are actually relevant to the course topic, or are they student scribbling their grocery list or something like that? It's hard to know, right? Maybe we just look at where the students are looking. Are the students looking at their cell phones? Are they looking out the window? Or are they looking at the professor? Just because you're looking at the professor, I don't think means that the student's actually paying strict attention to what's happening in the class. So that seems like a pretty imprecise measure. Some studies have asked students to sort of self-report, at various points during the class period, note how attentive do you feel you are being. So I suspect these are maybe slightly more reliable, but generally speaking, studies that involve self-reporting are pretty not that reliable. So again, a little bit questionable. At least one study measured heart rate and used that for a proxy for attention span. This actually seems not particularly useful to me. I mean, right? Certainly if there are big spikes in heart rate, high or low, maybe that means something. But if a student's heart rate is too low, are they falling asleep in my class? If their heart rate is too high, are they again thinking of something else? Again, all of these studies seem sort of problematic. One study found that students retained information best if it was presented in the last 15 minutes of a lecture. Another study found that students retained information best if it was presented in the first 15 minutes of a lecture. Yet another study found that students need 2 to 3 minutes of, quote, settling down time before they really got into the groove of a class. Another study found that the students retained information best from the first 5 minutes of a lecture. So again, all of these studies are really kind of all over the place. And there certainly are some studies that fit in this sort of 10 to 20 minute range. And I suspect that if were able to ask all of you in person, I think we'd agree that 10 to 20 minutes feels about right, anecdotally, right? Longer for some students, shorter for others, certainly dependent on the material that you're covering, but that seems to be about right to me. The studies are pretty universal in finding that the better the professor is, the longer students will pay attention. I don't think this is surprising at all, right? I also don't think this means that you have to be a juggling clown to keep your students' attention, right? Our definition of better professor does not need to mean performer, right? But again, not surprising that the better and more engaging the professor, the longer students were able to pay attention. One thing that can be tremendously helpful as you think about planning your courses is to include what Joan Mittendorf and Alan Kalish, who are experts in learning theory, call a change-up. A change-up is essentially doing something different from what you have been doing. So if you've been including for, let's say, a portion of lecture, then you want to include some kind of change-up for a few minutes before you either go back to a lecture or you go into some different learning module. It's become increasingly popular among learning experts to say that we should never use lectures. I actually disagree with this. I don't think that's right. I think there can absolutely be a time and a place for lecture, but we need to keep it reasonably short. And I also think this is very applicable to classes using the Socratic method, where if you are not the student being called on, it's seeming more like a lecture in the sense that it's passive learning, right? Socratic learning is active learning when you're the student having to answer the questions. And the idea, of course, is that the other students in the classroom are supposed to put themselves in that student's shoes and imagine how they would answer the question. But I think they can only do that for a certain amount of time before they start to zone out. So I think this is tremendously important for anyone teaching classes using the Socratic method. I would classify Socratic method as closer to lecture in that vein for these purposes, right? So the idea would be that you're going to have no more than 10 to 20 minutes of that sort of passive learning time, whether that's a lecture or a Socratic method discussion. And then you need to have something different. Then you have your change-up. Your change-up can be something that lasts for as little as 2 to 5 minutes, right? Or it could be something that goes on for like another 20 minutes. Like you might even view it as just another module in your course for that day. What the change-up is can be quite a bit of different things. Any kind of active learning works. You could have students do a pair and share. You could have students write down any questions that they have about the material that you've covered. You could have students look at a sample document. You could have students answer a sample practice question and then go over the answer. The change-up doesn't mean we're going to now stop thinking about today's lesson and talk about something else. It actually just means we're still talking about the same topic today. It's not a loss of instruction time. It's a change in the type of instruction that you're offering. Often professors will give students a physical break in the middle of class. For example, I usually teach classes that meet in 2-hour blocks. So after about 50 or 55 minutes, I will give my students a 5 or 10 minute break. I'll tell them to get up, move around the room, get a cup of coffee, go to the restroom, whatever they need to do. But I'm sure, as many of you have noticed, not all my students do. A lot of them just sit in their chairs. They usually pull out their cell phones. Maybe they talk to their friends. So it's not as an effective a break as I might hope that it would be. Some professors actually force their students to stand up and stretch, or maybe, walk around the room or things like that. That's an option. Some professors carry it off really well, and students actually love it. For other professors, though, that's going to feel inauthentic, and the students may resent being told what to do. So you need to decide if that's something you're comfortable doing or not. Regardless of whether or not you give this sort of physical break, incorporating the change-up, though, can be tremendously helpful in sort of bringing back your students' attention to the topic at hand. Here's an example of what that might look like in a 50-minute class. Middendorf and Kalish say that in a 50-minute class, you might have 1 change-up. In a 75-minute class, you might have 2, basically at roughly 1/3 and 2/3 of the way through the class. You absolutely do not need to follow this pattern exactly, but again, you want to sort of think about the flow of your class period, and I would suggest incorporating some kind of change-up after about every 10 to 20 minutes. Again, remember, the change-up can be tiny. The change-up could literally be, hey, go to poll everywhere and answer this question. That would be sufficient. Another change-up might take significantly longer if I have students do a pair and share exercise. But the key is we're doing something that's breaking my class up into smaller segments. So let's shift now to thinking more about our own attention spans and the advice that we might give to students about their attention spans. And I want to start by talking about cell phones. I am not one of those people who believe that cell phones are ruining our brains and we're all going to turn into a bunch of drooling idiots, but there is a fascinating study that came out of the University of Texas which found that cognitive capacity is reduced when your cell phone is in the same room with you, even if you aren't touching it and even if it's put away in a purse or a bag. Essentially, researchers asked study participants to come in and sit at computers where they engaged in a bunch of tasks that required full concentration. All cell phones were set to silent. Some people were allowed to put their cell phone face down on the desk, some people put it in a bag, and some people put their cell phone in a separate room. The people who scored the highest on the test were the people with their cell phones in a different room. They outperformed the people whose phones were in their bags, so not visible to the study participants. The people who had their phones in their bag did perform higher than the people who had their phones sitting on the desk face down. It also didn't matter if the phone was actually turned on or off. Didn't matter if the phone was face down or face up. Basically, if the phone was in the same room with you, it was a distraction. Researchers think that the reason for this is that we keep thinking about our phones, right? We keep wondering, do I have a new email? How many people liked my most recent social media post? What's the current number of COVID-19 cases in my state? We want to be checking these things constantly. And the process of trying to force yourself not to think about something, so not to think about checking my phone, also uses up cognitive capacity, right? So you're performing worse on tests that require cognitive function. I always make sure to tell my students about this study. They always seem really interested. I'm quite sure that 100% of them are not taking my advice, but I think that some of them might be, right? It's a really interesting study, and the students are very intrigued to hear about it. You may have heard this before, but it turns out there's no such thing as multitasking. There's only task switching. Humans are actually incapable of concentrating on multiple things at once. You may think you are, but actually you're jumping from task to task to task very, very quickly. So quickly that you're just rotating back and forth between all of them, and you think you're multitasking, but again, you're actually jumping from one to the other and back again. Studies also say that you aren't performing any of these tasks as optimally as you think you are. Interestingly, people are very bad at judging their own abilities in this way. People always think that they are the exception to the rule, but you generally aren't. Let me give you a goofy example. I live alone, and sometimes I will find myself eating dinner on my couch while watching TV and looking at my phone. I realize this makes my life sound very sad and pathetic. I promise you it's not always like this, and in fact, during non-pandemic times, I have what I consider a fun and fulfilled life. But putting that to one side, when I am watching TV, looking at my phone, and eating all at the same time, I am not doing a good job of being mindful of all of those things. I am frequently missing things that are happening on the TV show. I have to hit rewind to figure out what I missed. What plot point did I miss? I'm not really digesting anything on my phone. I'm just sort of bopping around from different things, looking at various sites. And I'm also probably eating more than I should, and more than I would eat if I was sitting at a table and maybe conversing with another person. So even though these are actually all things that I enjoy, TV, social media, food, I'm not actually enjoying all of them as much as I would if I were doing them separately. And I would absolutely be absorbing the information significantly better if I were doing those things separately. By combining them, I've actually made a worse experience for myself. Cell phone addiction is a real thing, right? If you've ever been on a really long airplane flight and have found yourself reaching for your phone and thinking like, oh, I haven't checked it in a while. Of course, now there are so many airplanes have Wi-Fi on them, so then you don't even have to be out of pocket for that long. But the average cell phone user touches her phone over 2,000 times per day. You can set your cell phone to tell you how many hours and minutes you have been using it per day. I suspect the results will horrify you. Mine have horrified me, in particular during the pandemic the last few months. So what can we do about this, right? Are we doomed to become idiots who just can't focus on anything? I don't think so. I think there are a few things that we can do that can help, but I do think this is something that's going to require action on our parts, and it's not going to happen if we just continue on the way we've been going. There is some pretty good evidence that suggests that reading on hard copies can help lengthen our attention spans and improve our ability to concentrate. I love my Kindle, but I also try to make sure that I read in paper part of the time. I also tell my students that they should be reading hard things, especially cases, in print, right? The studies are pretty compelling that we understand information better when we read it in print, and we are also more likely to remember it if we read it in print. That's really could be the subject of a different talk, but there's lots of research about how humans read differently on screens versus paper. My advice to students is don't buy the online versions of your textbooks if you can. Buy the hard copy versions. I'm very sensitive to the cost issues involved here, and certainly there is value in significantly cheaper online books, but the research is pretty compelling that students would be better off if they read the books in hard copy. And I also, again, try to be mindful for myself that if I am reading dense information, I should try and read it in print. I try and force myself to read my nonfiction books in hard copy, and then if it's just a fun novel or something like that, I might let myself read that on the Kindle. But doing some of your reading in print is really beneficial. Note that I'm not saying I never read on screens. Of course we all do, and I think that's fine, but I think doing some of our reading in print is really helpful. Meditation can also help. There are lots of resources out there about meditation and mindfulness, some of which are specific to law schools, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but I would highly recommend it. Cell phone visuals were actually designed using video game principles, which means bright colors, lots of fun features to make you keep coming back over and over again. One method that works for some people is to change your screen from the color screen to a black and white screen. I've given an example of what that looks like on the right here. I'll be honest, this didn't work for me personally. I tried it 2 different times, but some people report that it's pretty successful for them in terms of reducing their dependence on their cell phones. You can also realize that everything about social media is designed for tiny bits of attention, right? Instagram, it's just a photo, right? A tweet is only 280 characters. Everything is snarky memes and one-liners, right? I can think back to, say, 20 years ago when people who were sort of intellectual snobs, of which I consider myself one, and we sort of mocked people who only read magazines. And the idea was, oh, you're reading those really short articles as opposed to reading books. Well, now magazine articles seem long compared to so much of what I see on the internet today, right? I just think that's sort of worth thinking about. I've already talked about how putting your cell phone in a different room can be really helpful when you're trying to be productive, but at a minimum, you should turn off all of your notifications, right? And make sure you do this for your computer too, and not just your cell phone. If you're in the middle of typing into a document and a new email notification pops up, it is really hard not to click on that icon and read the email, right? Make your life easier and just take away the temptation. Turn off your notifications for a period of time. Let's say 30 minutes at a time, or 1 hour at a time, or maybe it's a half day, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Another suggestion is the Pomodoro technique, developed by Francesco Cirillo in the late 1980s. He used a tomato-shaped timer, so he named it Pomodoro, which means tomato in Italian. Essentially what you do here is pick one task that you're going to work on, and then you actually will set an actual timer and work on that task for 25 minutes. When the timer goes off, you take a 3 to 5 minute break, do something completely different. Then you come back, you set a new timer for 25 minutes and work again. You repeat the cycle 4 times, right? So basically 4 Pomodoros. And after that, you would take a longer break, recommended to be 25 or 30 minutes. There are lots of variations on this, and you can certainly play with the lengths of time and figure out what works best for you. But this can be really effective if you are on deadline and trying to finish something but somehow lacking in motivation. Again, these are all techniques I not only try to use for myself, but also ones I tell to my students. They seem to really enjoy hearing about them. Whether or not they adopt the techniques, of course, I don't know, but I enjoy sharing this information with them. Thank you for listening today and for sticking with it for the whole time. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, and we appreciate your participation in this virtual conference.